Ambrose Andriano is the founder of the Patristics Project, and his interests are in patristic hermeneutics, church history, theology, philosophy, and apologetics. Alvin Rapian is an editor for the Patristics Project, and his interests are in biblical hermeneutics and historical theology. Together, they examine the writings of the Church Fathers and provide commentary on the content, accessible discussions of rich and authoritative teaching. This is the Patristics Podcast.
Hello, Ancient Faith listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Patristics Podcast. I am your host, Ambrose, and with me, as always, is Alvin.
Hello.
Today we're going to be discussing the second apology of St. Justin Martyr. Alvin, do you want to give a little introduction to this?
Yeah, so in this text, St. Justin Martyr offers an apologetic, which, interestingly enough, does not explicitly appeal to Scripture, unlike the first apology, and it's addressed to the Roman authorities, particularly the Roman Senate, and it deals with an interesting incident, or at least it opens up with this incident, which we'll get to in a bit, concerning a woman divorcing her husband, a woman that recently converted to Christianity. Edward Hardy, scholar, early Christianity, says, an apology is by definition a speech for the defense. This goes back to Plato's Apology of Socrates, which has defined the literature of apologetics in antiquity, which includes the Christian structure and form of apologetics. And we'll see later in this letter that St. Justin Martyr also appeals to Plato and Socrates. Dennis Mins and Paul Parvis, also scholars of early Christianity, particularly they have worked on this letter, they state that even though the second apology by Justin Martyr is rightly called an apology, it differs from the first in that it is not necessarily a petition, that it doesn't demand a certain action except just to be answered. So what Justin Martyr here is doing, he is just appealing to the Roman authorities to just hear him out.
Yeah, in chapters 1 and 2, I'll just repeat some of what Alvin just said, that St. Justin the philosopher and martyr is writing to the Roman Senate, like Alvin said, about the prefect. He's addressing Quintus Urbicus. Is that how you say it, Alvin? Do you know?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, which dates around...
It's not the most romantic of names.
No, that's a pretty complicated name. Would not want it. Dates around AD 146. Justin is writing this apology in order to protect an unnamed woman who was accused of being a Christian by her ex-husband, and she was sentenced to death for admitting to it. The reason why she divorced her husband was because she refused to go along with his immoral practices now that she had a Christian conscience, practices that were contrary to the law of nature, it says. Justin writes how she became sober-minded after hearing the teachings of Christ, specifically Christ's warnings about the unrighteous experience of eternal fire. Because before, she was just as intemperate as her husband was. She actually tried to work it out with her husband after she converted. But he ended up going to Alexandria, and his conduct became even worse. So Justin is writing this apology to defend this woman that was converted by a fellow apologist named Ptolemaeus, or Ptolemy. He says that people who are subject to their own passions hate correction. It doesn't matter if the correction is from a father, a child, a friend, or brother, a husband or wife. It is difficult to urge someone to do what is right if they are chained to their own desires and love for pleasure. He says the evil demons who hate us do everything in their power to keep us subject to ourselves. Then they persuade judges and rulers to put Christians to death. In other words, demons persuade humans to not only love their sickness that leads to death, but they incite all the sick people to kill all the doctors who have the remedy. The doctors being the Christians, who Justin says are the exceptions. It is the Christians who are persuaded instead that, quote, the unjust and the intemperate shall be punished in eternal fire, but that the virtuous and those who live like Christ shall dwell with God in a state that is free from suffering, unquote. It should be noted that when Justin uses the phrase punished in eternal fire, it seems like his perspective is one of this is an act of wrath on the part of God. However, the Orthodox Church over time seems to have sided with a more monastic perspective that interprets punishment or torment as a more passive wrath, highlighting people like St. Anthony of Egypt, St. Isaac the Syrian, St. Maximus the Confessor, etc. Orthodoxy today doesn't really see hell as an act of punishment on the part of God, but rather passive torment of the individual. Here is an analogy for this. Imagine two people on the same beach during a hot and sunny day. The one person is relatively tan due to frequently being in the sun, and the other is pasty white due to frequently being indoors. After 8 hours, the two will have had very different experiences of the same sun. The first person will have enjoyed the warmth of the sun in a state free from suffering, whereas the second person will be tormented and punished with the sunburn. This reflects the inner reality of how people will have opposite experiences of the same God. As Scripture says, our God is a consuming fire in Hebrews 12:29, and again it says how he destroys with the brightness of his coming in 2 Thessalonians 2:8. And yet again it says people are tormented from the presence of the Lord, 2 Thessalonians 1:9. I mentioned this before, but St. Maximus the Confessor simply describes it best when he says how the entire world will one day become engulfed with the fiery presence of God like the burning bush. Those who are close to Christ will experience God's unquenchable fire and not be consumed, just like the three holy children in the fiery furnace. And the experience of everyone else is like the guards who threw them in. So that's just a little juxtaposition between how the doctrine today is commonly understood versus how it seems Justin Martyr understood it. So what do you got, Alvin?
Yeah, I really like your distinction there, and we'll get a little bit more into St. Justin Martyr's language in some of the later chapters as well. So without really repeating the situation, Ambrose covered it really well. There are two particular things that I want to note within these two chapters, 1 and 2. The first one being that Justin does not condemn the woman for seeking out divorce from her pagan husband, but neither does he affirm. And it probably isn't the focus of his letter to really hone in on that particular idea. Yet we see Justin, we can see there's some sympathy for her situation there. And I think that's very important to note within early Christianity and the extreme situation that she was living in, and how Justin comes to her aid. The second thing I want to note is reading Justin's attitude, and we'll see more of his attitude toward the authorities in light of Romans 13. So there's some interesting parallels here. So Paul's epistle to the Romans in chapter 13, he was exhorting the Romans to heed the authorities, for they are put in place by God. Justin asserts that demons incite judges, quote, to put us to death, end quote. So he's referring to the localized persecutions that Christians were facing, such as the one that he's referring to within this letter. So in light of debates of how to interpret Romans 13 and obedience to the law, there are several complementary routes one could take. So first, Paul the Apostle and Justin Martyr live in completely different contexts, so understanding how historical conditions affect interpretation is important. So Paul, in Romans 13, assumes that the government there is there for the good of humanity. You do good, you are rewarded, or you aren't punished at the very least. But if you do evil, then the sword is brought against you. But here, the situation is reversed. So Justin sees that there are unjust rulers punishing just people. So Justin's attitude and approach to authorities is not one of complete reverence, you could say, but of very strong critique. And I think it's really important to note that this is emerging out of his concern for Christians, but there's also a, not to use this phrase too strongly, but definitely there is something there, a political theology that underlies Justin's approach to the authorities. And we'll see his appeal to God as a judge that will really drive his argument.
Yeah, I think it's good that you pointed out, he doesn't just condemn this woman just because of her situation, but he really pastorally understands that it's a topic that ought to be viewed on a case-by-case basis, In chapter 3, Justin names the Cynic philosopher Crescens as being part of the problem, and who would eventually be the cause of Justin's martyrdom. Justin can't stand Crescens, and he sees him as a walking straw man factory, pretty much. Justin calls him, quote, a lover of bravado and boasting, for it would not be right to call the man a lover of wisdom, to gratify and please the erring multitude. He publicly testifies about things which he knows nothing, namely that Christians are godless and irreligious, unquote. Basically, Justin thinks Crescens is such a fail that he doesn't even deserve the title of philosopher. Justin continues to say how, after interrogating him, he discovered that Crescens doesn't know what he's talking about. He's no Socrates, he's just some dude who is highly opinionated and loves to share some fake news. What do you got, Alvin?
Yeah, Justin is not, he doesn't pull any punches in his criticisms. Like you're referring to, Crescens is a cynic, according to St. Justin, and not worthy of the name philosopher. But what I think is interesting here is I see some parallels. I don't want to draw too much out of this, between Crescens and then modern apologetic approaches. So, to get down specific, so we have certain prominent atheists within the public intellectual sphere who are, within their own fields, rightly regarded as authorities, whether they're scientists or maybe even philosophers.
You're talking like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and those. Yeah, those types, the new, the quote unquote new atheists, even though that term's at least a decade old now. Yeah.
So one of my major pet peeves in modern apologetics, which is really developed within the evangelical world, and you see this also in social media and even in person, it's the lack of establishing common knowledge or common ground. Insofar as atheists are usually working from a certain interpretation of Christianity, usually a reductionist or mischaracterization of Christianity, and the Christian apologist is often working, or they are working, from within their own particular tradition. So you have what some philosophers would say, two different language games going on, that even though you can use the same type of, I say Christianity, you say Christianity, but we mean two completely different things, because there is no interrogation that Justin does of Crescens here about what he actually knows and about the actual doctrinal truths that he seems to be criticizing, because we always seem to try to take on atheists or critics of Christianity on their own terms, but their own terms aren't always true to the representations of our own teachings. And I think this is very important that Justin makes it clear that this guy doesn't really know anything about Christianity. Therefore, his criticisms are really nothing we should heed. And the same can be said of modern criticisms of Christianity, which are not coming from an informed position.
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunately true the other way, too. Like that we as Christians caricature other people,
Exactly.
whether it's atheists or even just other denominations and whatnot.
Exactly. Yeah. We should try to understand the other person, like, on their own terms. Yeah.
Just like Justin did with Crescens. Should interrogate them.
Yep. Yeah, interrogate may be
So what do you
too
know?
strong. Yeah. I think the culture of antiquity, interrogating probably wasn't, offensive, but
right.
in our times, interrogating might be, a little too harsh.
And it may be a translation thing too. Like inquire would be a better word.
Right.
But anyway, in chapter 4, Justin responds to the idea that Christians should just kill themselves and go be with God and not bother people. Justin responds by saying God didn't carelessly make the world, but he made us to reflect his attributes and rejoices with those people. If all Christians killed themselves, Christians would be then responsible for putting an end to Christianity in the world, since there would be no one to instruct anyone else in the divine teachings. And since the ascent to virtue is to become human, the death of all Christians is simultaneously the death of the human race, because everyone will be acting according to their own self-destructive wills. It would be a constant descent into non-being. Christians also believe it is wrong to not speak the truth in all things, which makes Christians trustworthy. Thus, Justin seeks to convince his audience that their prejudice against Christians is unjust, based on the easily refuted arguments of Crescens. What about you, Alvin?
Yeah, I think you covered that wonderfully. So I think in addressing that criticism that Christians should just kill themselves and go be with God and leave the Greco-Romans alone, Justin really underlines that humanity has a certain purpose, that it is not simply about going to be with God, and so this so interestingly anticipates some of the 18th and 19th century very soul-focused ideas of Christianity that we see in America. But there's a certain idea of being in the world and participating in virtue that is so important for Justin.
Chapter 5, Alvin. The infamous Chapter 5.
It's going to be fun.
This is interesting. Okay. In Chapter 5, Justin explains his cosmology by taking us back to the infamous events of Genesis 6, which talks about the sons of God reproducing with the daughters of men, which then created the giants. However, his perspective is clearly also influenced by the Book of Enoch as well. I'm going to take some time to dive deep into some of this stuff so you listeners can get some context. According to Justin's cosmology, God created the world and everything in it, including the weather and seasons, and made it subject to the care of man. However, as mankind was appointed to tend to the earthly things, angels were appointed to do the same thing, but for mankind. It is possible that angels might have been tasked to do things like control the weather. However, something went wrong. Some of the angels, at least 200, according to chapter 7 of the Book of Enoch, became captivated by women and selected wives for themselves and bore children. The Book of Enoch says that the angels, led by Samyaza, began teaching the women sorcery, incantations, sacrifices, witchcraft, you name it. The pregnant women then bore giants, after spiritually uniting themselves to fallen angels through the occult. The Book of Enoch also says the giants grew to 300 cubits, which is an insane number. That's the exact height of the Louisiana State Capitol building. These giants were obviously too big because they devoured crops faster than man could produce them. Because of this problem, the giants started to eat men alongside every other living creature. Anyways, so Justin is saying that these angels and their giant offspring became the demons. And this is where all mythology originates for Justin. The fallen angels became enslaved to their passions, and for whatever reason needed humans to do horrific things. These demons then began to speak to oracles and influenced poets and mythologists to create stories about themselves and to be worshipped as gods. In other words, you have a bunch of demons one day speaking to the ancient Greeks, telling them, "My name is Zeus," or "My name is Hades. This is what I'm about. This is how you please me." This probably happened when the giants were still alive. Remember, this was before the Tower of Babel, so humanity would have no doubt been intimidated into worshipping these giants. This mythology would have been passed down the generations to Noah and his descendants, so it makes sense why you have both Zeus and Odin. The pagan traditions seem to share a common ancestral tradition that goes back to the events of Genesis 6. The fallen angels and their demonic offspring essentially hijacked man's perspective of the true God in order that man might worship a counterfeit, an angel that only has a power given by God. What do you have, Alan?
I'm really glad you brought up First Enoch because I took a course in apocalypticism with a scholar from Yale, Dr. John J. Collins, and we got to talk a little bit about this particular fall of the angels and then also eschatology. And I'm starting to wonder now how much, if any, of Justin's eschatology is informed by First Enoch, because Justin is very adamant about the judgment of the fallen angels here, and so was First Enoch.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who don't know, First Enoch emerged in Second Temple Judaism just a little bit right around the time of Jesus. So we have this, some scholars think, in a new emerging form of Judaism that prioritized Enoch over Moses. Some say it was complementary to the Second Temple tradition, that although it was an outlier in mystical tradition. So there's the debate raging on, but I think it's interesting that Justin Martyr picks up on this. So in 1 Enoch 19, not to repeat too much of what Gary said, but we have the archangel Uriel saying to Enoch, "Here shall stand the angels who have connected themselves with women, and their spirits assuming many different forms that are defiling mankind and lead them astray into sacrificing demons as gods, till the day of the great judgment in which they shall be judged till they are made an end of. And the women also of the angels who went astray shall become sirens." So we see here very interesting blending and imagery between some of Greco-Roman myths of sirens with some of the Second Temple developments of angelology. Then in 1 Enoch 69, it describes how fallen angels had relations with women, like Ambrose was referring to. But also, it taught them war, passed on secret wisdom in writing with ink and paper, and etc., etc. And you see that St. Justin also refers to some of this, that the fallen angels taught them magical writings, that they were enslaved to lustful passions. And among men, St. Justin says, the fallen angels sowed murders, wars, adulteries, temperate deeds, and all wickedness. So you see a lot of the same thematic elements coming to the surface for St. Justin and First Enoch. So I'm not saying, and I'm sure Ambrose is not saying either that First Enoch is authoritative in any sense for the Orthodox tradition, but it is interesting that Justin seems to be relying on this tradition found in First Enoch, and perhaps even trying to appeal to Greco-Roman ideas of fallen angels, perhaps, even though he is at the same time subverting their pantheon of the gods.
This is just a question for you, Alvin. Do you think Justin and others, because like Jude also talks about this, I think it's like verse 15 or something.
Right.
Do you think at this time period many of the Christians and Jews essentially saw Enoch as history, like as a historical thing?
You know, this is something that's come up in courses on apocalypticism and courses in I've taken on New Testament canon, and the answer is it's complicated. Because I mean, they may have saw it as very informative. They may have also known it through secondhand literature, through oral tradition. Obviously, Justin Martyr is comfortable with repeating that to his address to the Roman authorities.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really sure if it functions more apologetically or doctrinally, and it's just very hard to really say one way or the other. I think it was probably a mixed bag.
Yeah.
With Jude, it seems to be a strong appeal to at least that particular textual tradition. Or it's not even really a textual tradition. Jude's appeal to Enoch there does not really come from any particular text. It's more of like a conglomeration of ideas from Enoch.
Right.
So yeah, it's hard to say either way. But we do know that Enoch did play a role in the ideas that circulated within.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Second Temple and early Christianity.
Then it makes matters even more complicated when you have the Ethiopian Orthodox Church have it in their canon.
Right.
That.
I'm taking Jewish interpretation right now, and we've talked about First Enoch a little bit, and it's very elusive, very mysterious.
Yeah. Which just makes it interesting.
Yeah.
In chapter 6, Justin continues his last thought of chapter 5 about how men named their gods based upon the names that the fallen angels and the demons gave them. Which, as a side note, the commonalities across mythologies, such as Zeus in Greek mythology, Jupiter in Roman, Amun-Ra in Egyptian, or Odin in Norse, would have probably been understood by Justin as being different cultures worshipping the same demon. In contrast to what he said about the names of the demonic false gods, Justin talks about the names of the true God. He starts by saying, the unbegotten Father has no name. He says words like Father or God or Creator or Lord are not names, but titles that speak to his goodness and works. In other words, the names we have for God describe the various ways we experience God's energies. We know he's the creator because he created man. We know he's God because of his authority and power. But we don't know what's on... Let me put it this way. We don't know what's on God's driver's license. We know some of the names used for God in particular places and times, but we don't know what the eternal God calls himself when people aren't around. Simply put, from the earthly perspective of man looking up to God, it is impossible to have one human word to capture the essence of God. You can combine every good word that exists in every language, and it would still fall short of the glory of God. Therefore, for us humans, God can only have many names. Here, Justin is not saying something new. It was the standard philosophy at the time. The first century Stoic philosopher Seneca once said that the titles of God are as numerous as his works. And that's in On Benefits 472 for those interested. St. Clement of Alexandria says that we call the divine good or mind, or being itself, or Father, or God, we speak not as if we were expressing its name, but because we have no alternative, we make use of good names on which the intellect can settle, rather than wander off in search of other names." Unquote. And that's in Stromata 5:1282. St. Garger the theologian says that every name we give for God are from his actions in the world, because none of them express his essence. And that's in 4th Oration 17-19. He then goes on to talk about the significance of the name Jesus, which he says is God's name as man and Savior. He mentions how demoniacs were cured only by the name of Jesus, and not by any kind of exorcist or doctor, some other kind of exorcist or doctor. What do you got, Alvin?
Man, I think you did beautifully on that, especially drawing from Seneca there, really contextualizing some of the Greco-Roman context, and then Justin's approach to naming God. I really don't have much to add, but I will say that I think it's important that Justin puts this forward, especially in an apologetic context, because it really troubles the waters for Greco-Roman theology that they can presume to name the gods, especially with some of the temples and the sacrifices that they were doing, that they believed that they were actually communing with these divine figures. But Justin wanted to really distance humanity and God in a way to say that the gods aren't something or people or divine figures beholden to us, that we are beholden to this unnamed God. And we should really take that distance seriously. So it's a very interesting theological move to make in an apologetic context, but I think it's the right one because it really upholds the transcendence of God. Even transcendence does not even touch upon the true distance that we have between God.
Would you say that there's a connection between this very apophatic, unnamed God and the temple, or Paul's address to the unknown God, and so like?
Oh yeah, I definitely think so. I think you're totally right, and I think so. Paul and Justin here are trying to appeal to perhaps that particular aspect that the Greco-Romans, that was the common ground that they had, but Justin and, well, St. Paul really radicalizes this idea and takes it to an even further extent.
Interesting.
So yeah, I think you're totally right.
In chapters 7-9, Justin talks about the deterministic theological perspective of Stoics. He goes out of his way to explain that Christian teaching is contrary to the philosophical notions of fate and predestination. He says, quote, "We do not affirm that men do what they do or suffer what they suffer by fate. Rather, each man sins or acts righteously by free choice." Unquote. Justin says the nature of all that is made is capable of both vice and virtue, because nobody would be virtuous if they did not have the option to reject vice. Instead of being virtuous, mankind would simply be programmed. Morality would not be intrinsic to humanity. It would be extrinsically dependent upon the programmer. Justin makes the point that no lawmaker actually believes Stoic determinism, because ethics always involves reasonably prescribing some actions and condemning other actions. He says any Stoic will affirm basic laws of ethics, yet their disposition towards ethical law contradicts their determinism, because if every human action is the result of fate, virtue and vice would not truly exist. Justin says, despite the fact that the Stoics were wrong on determinism, he praises their moral teachings and thought they were admirable. He mentions how Stoics such as Heraclitus and Musonius were even put to death because of their moral teachings. Remember how Justin said he is probably going to be killed for his moral stance. This is when Justin states his magnum opus concept. The quote that I come back to time and time again, personally. He says, quote, "The seed of the Logos is implanted in the whole human race," unquote. Meaning the Stoics, like Heraclitus, were partially following Christ, even though they were ignorant of that fact. In other words, if you search any of these primitive philosophical or religious systems hard enough, you will find Christ in seed form, just waiting to be watered with the gospel. This is precisely what St. Paul did when he spoke to the Athenians about their altar to the unknown God. Despite being in a pagan culture, he nonetheless spotted the seed of the Logos and watered it. This is how all Christian evangelism and apologetics ought to work, in my opinion. Far too often do I see superstitious Christians so afraid of anything pagan that they hide in their little bubble and never talk to anyone who isn't Christian. I've seen these same Christians get really worked up and offended simply because they saw a Christmas tree or a yin-yang. It has pagan roots, they'll say. The cross has pagan roots. Like the cross has pagan roots. Do we throw out the cross simply because it has pagan roots?
I hope not.
I hope not too. The work of the Christian is not to hide and be superstitious. The work of the Christian is to reinterpret the world. Instead of being afraid of the yin-yang, why not teach someone about the incarnation and how it reveals the two natures of Christ? Or how about you use it to show how God became man, that man might become God? I cannot stress how important this is to understand. St. Justin absolutely gives us a word today. Find the seed and water it. Expose the Logos in all things. This even translates over to how we engage with politics. No matter what political party you identify as, Republican, Democrat, Vermin Supreme, whatever, find the Logos in the opposing perspective. As St. Paisios the Athonite once said, quote, "Those who resemble the fly seek to find evil in every circumstance and are preoccupied with it. They see no good anywhere. Those who resemble the honeybee will only see the good in everything," unquote. Justin says these nominal philosophers assert that what Christians say about hell is just fear-mongering, and the desire to live righteously is out of fear, not because it is good or noble. To this, Justin says that if what Christians say about hell is not true, then God doesn't exist. If he does exist, then he doesn't care about human beings, and virtue and vice are illusions. Here we see Justin utilizing a Stoic framework to refute Stoic contradiction. If there is no consequence to living an unjust life, then there is no point to living a just life. Even framing it that way is misleading, because if the unjust do not have a negative experience in the afterlife, then they cannot be called unjust in this life, which then deconstructs the entire framework. Basically, Justin is saying that if he's wrong about hell, then the Stoics are inconsistent in their ethics. People who violate civil laws should always be considered unjustly punished in the Stoic paradigm, because fate led them to do what they did. And if fate led them to do what they did, then that person cannot be seen as unjust, because that is simply the natural order of things. What do you got, Alvin?
I think it's funny that you covered so well this hopeful view of Christ and the Logos and within the pre-Christian philosophers. And
I just love that.
And I'm going to talk about the doctrine of eternal fire within Justin. It's a nice contrast there. So as Ambrose said, everyone is capable of vice and virtue, and everyone has free will. St. Gregory of Nyssa also really hammers down this argument elsewhere in later centuries. And Justin contrasts this doctrine with the Stoics, as Ambrose was talking about, who hold to a very strong idea about the necessity of fate. And I think to really understand Justin's doctrine of judgment and eternal fire, it should be really framed in terms of justice. So Justin really wants to assert that the fallen angels and those humans who fall under judgment will justly, quote, justly suffer in eternal fire the punishment of whatever sins they have committed, end quote. And it's tempting to try to interpret Justin in light of later Orthodox conceptions of hell, but we should really try to understand him in his own terms and take his own approach seriously here. And this may scandalize some people, but there really is a retributive dimension very much present within Justin's theology of hell. And again, later, Justin explicitly states that eternal fire is connected to, quote, just punishment and penalty, quote. And I know those terms, punishment and penalty, when connected to any type of idea of hell, is usually thrown as a Western idea, but really we see it here as early as Justin. So then Justin goes on to state that this doctrine of eternal fire is not a rhetorical move, like Ambrose was expounding upon, for people living virtuously, that it's not a fear tactic. Without some kind of retributive system, God does not care about humanity, and neither virtue nor vice is anything. So what Justin is concerned about, to reiterate, is justice. And in the true sense of the word. It's not an arbitrary justice that is outside of God. It's not an arbitrary justice system that says things must be a certain way. But it's just in upholding this idea that virtuous non-Christians and Christians have been killed, and those that have put them to death must face a type of judgment for the sins committed against them.
It's definitely appropriate that he's using that kind of language when he's like writing a, political, governmental appeal. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Like he's speaking to people who know exactly what that is all about.
Right. Like you should know the weight that justice carries.
Right. In chapter 10, Justin says that whatever philosophers got right in the BC days, it was because they found and contemplated some aspect of the Logos without knowing it. And since they didn't see the full picture of Christ, they contradicted themselves. That's how you get a Stoic both affirming virtue and undermining the belief in virtue at the same time. He also says that Socrates was a kind of partial prefiguring of Christ kind of thing in the philosophical world, because he more than anyone taught people to reject the demons they called gods, and he was killed for it. However, nobody died for Socrates, his teachings, unlike Christ. But, at the same time, you have to give Socrates credit, because he was pretty good, all things considered. What do you think, Alvin?
I think there are some parallels to be drawn. Some would protest that perhaps St. Justin is making a bit of a leap comparing Christians to Socrates, as especially there's different contexts for their arrest and death. But nonetheless, and like you pointed this out earlier in some of the previous chapters, about the connection between Greek philosophy and Christianity really centering around logos theology. Mm-hmm. But I kind of want to nuance this a little bit as well, that the logos theology found within Christianity is precursor not only in Greek philosophy, but also in Philo of Alexandria, who was an early contemporary of the early Christian movement. within the first century.
Give us that Second Temple stuff, Alvin.
Right, yeah. So Philo of Alexandria is one of my my loves. So some early church fathers thought that Philo of Alexandria was so great, and because he was so influential, that they there's this story that Philo of Alexandria met Saint Peter at Rome, and they became friends. I think even one legend has it that Philo of Alexandria became a Christian or something like that. But it's really a testimony to how Philo of Alexandria took that logos theology within Greek philosophy and he Judaized it. He made it applicable to the Greek scriptures in Judaism. And that really set the foundation for Clement of Alexandria and later theologians, especially those that were from Alexandria, the influence from Philo, Origen, very strongly influenced by Philo. So we cannot forget the Judaic roots of that transformation of logos theology from Greek philosophical rhetoric into Christian theology.
Yeah.
And another interesting point is that Christ, Justin asserts, became the whole rational being, both body and reason and soul. And this is really important because it points to the holistic view of Christianity, again, against that idea that Christianity is just a soul-based religion that we can just kill ourselves after becoming Christians and go to be with God. But it's in fact a participation within all the virtues that constitute soul and body. And without the body, we aren't able to enact virtue. That souls, because they are immaterial, they aren't able to practice virtue in the same substantial way that they are with bodies.
I'm glad that you mentioned Philo. He's such an intriguing character in history. Yeah.
He's so overlooked, especially in, well, just studies in general. So many of the church fathers are, in one way or another, very much indebted to Philo of Alexandria.
Yeah. Ambrose, I mean, he's a big-time Philo lover.
Yeah.
In chapters 11 through 12, Justin also finds it noteworthy to show how Christians completely disregard death, which is also featured in what we learned of Athanasius. However, Justin is speaking from experience. He remembers back before he converted to Christianity, he heard Christians slandered and saw that they were fearless in the face of death. They didn't fear what everyone else did. It was this that led Justin to conclude that there is no way Christians were involved in evil or love of pleasure, because wicked people are too attached to their goods to not fear death. Wicked people see death as the total depravity of pleasure. So the Christians' response to death was proof of their virtue in of itself, which is really interesting. Justin also says that many Greeks became imitators of Zeus and other gods in homosexual intercourse. That was a shock to me. Justin seems to believe that sodomy was one way to worship some of the Greek gods, or rather, as he would say, demons. He says Christians persuade people to flee such teachings and practices because God watches over all things justly. What do you got, Alvin?
I was really intrigued by this quote in chapter 12. For having put some to death on account of the accusations falsely brought against us, they also dragged to the torture our domestics, either children or weak women, and by dreadful torments forced them to admit those fabulous actions which they themselves openly perpetrate, about which we are the less concerned because none of these actions are really ours, and we have the unbegotten and ineffable God as witness both of our thoughts and deeds. And then later he says, but we are not concerned, since we know that God is a just observer of all. And this is in the context of the persecutions that the Christians were facing. But again, to contextualize this, within a political letter. And this is part of the political theology that underlies Justin's protest, is that because God is a just observer of all, we can say against the government whether things are just or not, because we try to hold him accountable within the larger scheme of our eschatology. So it's very important for Justin to emphasize that.
Yeah. In chapters 13 through 15, and this is the end of the book here, Justin reiterates what he says in chapter 8. He says, quote, "I do not confess that the teachings of Plato are alien to those of Christ, but that they are not in all ways the same as them, just as neither are those of others, Stoics and poets and prose writers. For what each of them proclaimed was good, when he saw from a part of the divine spermatic logos what is related to it. But when they contradict themselves in their principal teachings, they are shown not to have heavenly wisdom and infallible knowledge." Unquote. He says any good in these writers belongs to Christians. They were able to see the truth dimly, pretty much. Justin ends his appeal with the hope that the people he wished to defend will have a fair chance of being freed from ignorance with regards to what people think Christians are about. He quickly makes another pass at their inconsistent logic by pointing out how Christians are not accused of anything that one of their gods didn't already do. So punishing people for the very things that their gods do does not make much sense. Interestingly, Justin makes a reference to the influence of the New Testament magician Simon Magus. You know the one, the guy who asked Peter where he could buy some of that Holy Spirit juice. Apparently, and St. Irenaeus says this too, Simon Magus is the origin of all Christian heresies. Justin says how he despised the wicked and deceitful doctrine of Simon in his own nation, and wants very badly to expose his teaching so people can be converted. And Irenaeus was very much influenced by Justin Martyr. But we're going to get into that next time, aren't we, Alvin?
Yep. It's going to be lots of fun.
Yeah, next time we're going to do Irenaeus' Against Heresies, Book 3, which is going to be a good one.
You're going to hold your hats.
Yeah. But that's it for Justin Martyr. What do you think, Alvin?
Super interesting. Not really what you would expect in an apologetic letter. A lot of different themes and different views going on.
Yeah.
Covered a woman getting divorced in that situation. Then we had the political appeal, or the theopolitical appeal, if you will. You had Justin's more doctrine of hell, or he doesn't really say hell, he just says eternal fire and punishment. Naming God, which was interesting. And then we had the thing about First Enoch. So a lot of different things coming out of this very small letter, which yeah, it's quite amazing, actually.
Really packs a lot in there. You got anybody to give a shout out to, Alvin?
Shout out to my lovely wife. Her name is Aubrey. Her patron saint is Saint Augustine. So she goes by Augusta, and she got me Taco Bell for dinner tonight.
That is very kind.
This is very kind.
Very kind. I will give a shout out to my wife, Catherine, and I'm just thankful for her. She lets me do this.
Yeah,
and she doesn't give me any slack for it.
Our wives let us talk to each other.
Yeah.
It's very nice of them.
That's pretty great. Pretty great. But I also want to give a shout out to Father Chim Honiki, who's my parish priest and gave us the go-ahead to even do this. So that's pretty cool. And also, I've befriended a Catholic woman named Madison, who I've been in contact with to just kind of understand some Catholic perspectives on things, and it's been really helpful. Shout out to Madison. And where can people find you on the internet?
They can find me at www.thepoorandspirit.com. They can find both of us at patristics.co. And then my Twitter handle is poor_in_spirit. Yeah. How about you?
You can find me at ambrosiaster.com and on Twitter at Adriano Gary with 2 R's. And we'll...
also,
Go ahead.
The Patristics Project is also on Facebook.
Yes.
Have we mentioned that?
I don't think so. I guess kind of assumed that.
Well, we're on Facebook.
Yes, we are on Facebook. Go like us over there. And like I said, next time we'll be talking about St. Irenaeus Against Heresies, Book 3. Look forward to that. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Patristics Podcast. To learn more about the Patristics Project, please visit www.patristics.co. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.